Carlos, are you ready?
Yeah.
Milton, and most importantly, the judge. All right. Hendrickson affirms the resolution. Contention 1 is smuggling. Millions of refugees have used life-threatening pathways to leave the Middle East. Michael Birnbaum from the Washington Post explains, due to the lucrative business of smugglers and the reduced cost of refugees, 90% of refugees reach their territory via smugglers to ease at least a part of the trip. Shea of the Amnesty International explains, inadequate government action is the chief cause of smuggling and trafficking. When people are desperate, nothing will stop them from leaving. Francois Crépeau of the UN corroborates the restrictive border policies of the EU create the business of smuggling. Fortunately, the European Council on Refugees explains, we could put smugglers out of business immediately if the EU would create legal channels for refugees to reach Europe. The reason is simple. If countries accept more refugees, then these legal channels can supplement the illegal channels of smugglers. The UN corroborates, without a regular alternative available to reach safety, people will continue to pay smugglers and risk their lives through dangerous journeys. Eliminating smugglers brings 3 benefits. A, reducing funding for terrorism. Vivienne Walt from Time explains, the movement of migrants across the Middle East towards Europe has generated $323 million for the Islamic State. Tackling smuggling can not only protect refugees, but play a part in reducing violence. The RAND Corporation corroborates. Countering ISIS demands operations to shut down sources of finance. B, through reducing human trafficking. The International Business Times writes, refugees tell horror stories about being sexually assaulted, ransomed, and often sold into slavery. The economies of smuggling is the callous driver that leads to the death of migrants. The Gatestone Institute for International Policy laments, Syrian girls are the ones who suffer the most. Creating these new channels can help reduce the availability of these traffickers. And finally, C, saving lives. Nick Robbins, September, explains, traffickers often replace proper transport with overloaded, rickety boats that frequently capsize or leave people stranded, and use cramped trucks in which refugees can suffocate to death. Some travelers even face violent armed robberies while at sea. Without legal channels, people will continue to travel through perilous routes. Robbins explains, in 2015 alone, more than 381,000 people attempted to enter Europe by sea. This is uniquely problematic because the International Migration Organization writes, nearly 70% of deaths recorded refer to migrants who are missing at sea. In the world economy, smuggling will only grow. Strict border policies create this problem, and Nick Robin contextualizes, Europe is trying to solve this very problem through even more strict borders. Our second contention is season camps. When Nadi Sidani was growing up in Lebanon, she used to wear beautiful textiles made in Syria. Now, she's become a humanitarian medical aide who finds it surreal to see Syrian mothers wrapping babies in plastic. This is one of 1,000 horror stories as a result of Syrian refugee camps. Alexander Betts, in his book, Refugees and International Relations, explains, an increasing number of host states respond to refugee situations by pursuing policies of containing refugees in isolated and insecure camps. Specifically for refugees, journalist Anne Lum highlights the condition of the camps are simply utterly inhumane. This is a regional problem because the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace laments long-term refugee camps come with social security challenges that plague host countries. However, accepting refugees and removing camps brings 3 benefits. A, stopping sexual assault. Bobby Greenward from the Guardian reports in sprawling camps, aid workers report a soaring number of incidents of domestic violence and rampant sexual exploitation. B, reducing disease. Anne Lum again explains, because the country's infrastructure has been steadily destroyed, it has become impossible to vaccinate in the country or risk one's life. As a result, she concludes chronic diseases like diabetes are unlikely to get medications, and no immunizations means increasing likelihood of infectious diseases spreading, which is problematic when camp conditions are so tightly packed. And finally, C is reducing recruitment. Rema Baydon from Arizona State University writes, the circumstances in camps breed conflict and act as a catalyst for refugee, radical, militant groups. In order to prevent terror, Carlos and I are very proud to affirm.
Can we see 90% of refugees or something?
From give the card in.
It was like the first card you read.
Yeah. Just a highlight.
Incorrect?
Yep. Starting. Yeah.
How many seconds was that?
Yeah, and then we'll keep running.
Okay.
Alright, stop it.
That was 19 more seconds. So 27 total.
Okay.
Blake, you ready?
Yeah.
Opponents ready?
Yes.
Most importantly, the judge. We negate and observe that according to global humanitarian assistance, humanitarian aid is an action designed to save lives. As such, accepting more refugees is a form of humanitarian aid. Contention 1 is disaster. Christopher Coyne of George Mason University explains that in reality, humanitarian action escalates conflict, perpetuating the very suffering humanitarianism seeks to alleviate. This becomes uniquely problematic because Weiner from Princeton impacts that conflict causes whole regions to become unlivable and thus produce more refugees. Moore from FSU quantifies that every year of civil war increases refugee flows by 79%. Thus, unfortunately, voting pro creates two global disasters, and the first is conflict escalation. Gutmansky explains that when nations open their doors to accept more refugees, it prolongs a conflict because wealthier people are better equipped to leave a country experiencing a civil war, thereby shrinking the legal economy and expanding the black market. This provides the belligerents with access to more resources to keep fighting. And that's why IB Times finds that the black market in Syria is providing ISIS with revenues of up to $2 million a day, prolonging the conflict. The second disaster when you affirm is interventions. Tony Cartolucci from Global Research indicates that while the Western media attempts to portray the sudden influx of refugees appearing out of nowhere at Europe's gates, the reality is for years they have been gathering in expansive, well-funded refugee camps as part of a long-standing strategy to justify NATO invading and occupying Syrian territory. An alternative is to focus on how to gain humanitarian access backed by military power. The refugee crisis is a contrivance to justify military aggression, with refugees being used as human pawns. Schweitzer explains that this is because the humanitarian label is used by governments to justify military intervention. That's why Regan empirically quantifies that the existence of a humanitarian crisis increases the probability of intervention by 60%. Thus, Maupin concludes that even though the direct result of humanitarian missions is chaos, destruction, and continued violence, it is then used to justify further intervention. It is a twisted downward spiral with two additional impacts. The first is more human rights abuses. Leslie from Northwestern explains that because humanitarian interventions increase the chance that rebel leaders are going to achieve their objectives, such leaders have an incentive to engage in provocative actions that make atrocities more likely. Durson Pexton empirically indicates that military interventions deteriorate respect for rights, and intervention increases the probability of killing by 103%, torture by 66%, and imprisonment by 70%. But the second impact is creating more refugees. Cooperman indicates that humanitarian intervention escalates rebellion because it encourages groups to believe that by violently provoking state retaliation, they attract intervention to help achieve their political objectives. For example, intervention increased the duration of Libya's civil war by approximately 6 times and its death toll by 7 to 10 times. And Schmeitzel quantifies the effect this has on refugee numbers. 59,000 more people flee where there are military interventions than with no intervention. Moreover, a downward spiral results from this increased intervention. For example, as the civil war exacerbates due to these failed humanitarian interventions, countries such as Russia are also now intervening, and according to Newsweek, Russian airstrikes have created 100,000 more refugees. This cycle continues to exacerbate if you vote pro and increase interventionism. Contention 2, international realism. Craig explains that the term humanitarian stands in contrast to realism, which suggests that states should base their actions on national interests. However, Jahangir indicates that policies aimed at restoring universal human rights in other countries failed at taking the realist perspective. For example, America's liberal project has resulted in war for 2 out of every 3 years since 1989, therefore resulting in more global conflict. Specifically, Miller explains that the alternative of inaction is actually the best option, especially since a foreign power's exit from a conflict can be as dangerous for the country as the original conflict. In fact, in February 2016, a ceasefire in Syria was agreed upon by the international community. Within a month, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported that violence in Syria has decreased by 90% since this ceasefire, despite violations here and there. Thus, Voting con is the best choice because COSAC explains that it allows internal resolution and local participation, which is necessary to reach a successful settlement. So to prevent more death, decrease human rights abuses, we strongly urge a con ballot.
Okay, before CROSSFIRE, we're going to take a look at can I see the evidence that the Syrian thing about 90% decreasing of
The ceasefire.
the ceasefire, yes.
Is that Miller?
I think it was Miller. Okay, starting here. We have 135.
Are we ready for CROSSFIRE?
Just give me 1 second.
Okay. All right, Mike, I'll take the first question.
Yeah, can I get the 10 minutes?
Oh, you're not ready.
Okay, Judge, you ready?
Yeah.
First
Okay.
question goes.
Okay, so my first question for you is, why hasn't NATO already intervened in the status quo?
So
So you're talking about the problems of NATO
Yeah,
intervention.
so they're literally building camps in northern Syria and in Turkey and encouraging refugees to come so that they can push their military closer and closer. Right?
Okay,
Like, in
wait,
status quo. They haven't
wait
done
a
it.
second. When intervention mean to invade?
Yeah, like they're
Wait a
doing
second.
it in the status
How
quo.
can you invade if you're pushing the refugees more towards NATO's land? NATO would have to come into
So
Syria.
here, let me explain. So Turkey in northern Syria, Turkey has already been encouraging refugees in building camps, not only in southern Turkey, but also in northern Syria, so that they can attract refugees, so that NATO and Turkey can justify this to use intervention, which we've already seen in the status
Okay,
quo.
and your
Can I
evidence.
ask a question now, though, because you just asked 2 in a row?
I think I asked one, but
All
go
right,
ahead.
well, you just, okay. So how does accepting refugees equal building more legal channels? Like your advocacy is to substantially accept more refugees. How is that equal to like building more legal channels?
Okay, so you can't necessarily like build like the legal channel we're talking about. Like it's more of a policy. You provide the legal channel so they can actually get across the border without being like, so basically what happens is if it's not a legal channel, they get to the border and they just simply can't get through. However, if it's legal, they simply walk across the
But your
border.
evidence on that, does it say that like, let's say you build these legal channels, would that solve the refugee crisis?
Yes, but what we tell you is we prevent the death of refugees, and that's what's really
I'm
critical
asking
about the
which evidence
crisis.
says that like the 28 EU member states alone, if they do agree to this, how would they be able to take in all those refugees that you guys talk about?
Yes, they would.
They
That's
would?
what the resolution's asking. Countries of the world should accept more.
No, I'm
illegal
asking you
channels are
evidence
open.
to give us that says that they could do it.
Yeah, that's what the Washington Post says.
Okay, could we see that?
Yeah, of course.
Can
So
you ask me a question?
yes. So your evidence was 60% increased intervention. Does the crisis go away in the world economy? Does
Yeah,
the explain how?
So here's what we're saying. In spite of 2 things. The first is that there are some violations. The second thing is that Turkey, and despite NATO's actions that we mentioned, is that the con world is better than the pro world because we've already seen that inaction, or specifically has yielded the ceasefire, which decreased violence.
Okay, so I have a question about inaction real quick. So is this ceasefire, like, because they're always violated, there's always more ceasefires, this is like a short-term benefit, right?
No. Here's
Why is this not?
Here's why. Because in the pro world, there's no ceasefire. In the con world, I will admit.
Wait. Why is there no ceasefire in the pro
I'm
world?
explaining it right now. So like in the con world, I admit there's a ceasefire, but it's flawed. But what we're advocating, what we're going to argue today, is that a flawed ceasefire is better than no ceasefire insofar as we decrease violence on
You
death.
still didn't explain
But
why
now-
we don't advocate for a ceasefire, though. You didn't. That's not explaining why can't we have a ceasefire in the world of pro.
That's what our entire contention 1 is for. We're talking about intervention. That's why it doesn't happen. But can I ask you a question now?
Sure.
So you guys talk about refugee camps in your second contention. Aren't there refugee camps in Europe? By the way, it's, oh yeah.
Yes. The problem is the status quo is not affirming. When we affirm, that's when we remove the camps, not when you vote neg.
Thanks. Can you show me your Washington Post card that says that Europe can accept all the refugees? Well, we took 27 seconds. So. But we'll start once we get there.
I'm a little confused on what you did.
That Europe can accept. So just you the vice versa and get names
Wait, I'm sorry. What did you ask?
Like your partner said he had a Washington Post card that says like Europe can accept the refugees if you build illegal channels, like they can fix the problem or whatever. The crisis.
Okay, so it's actually Amnesty International.
Yeah, that's fine as long as it says what he said it says. Yeah. If you want, do you want to give it to us after rebuttal if you want to look for it, or do you?
I can look for it.
Okay, so yeah, you can just give it to us after rebuttal.
You need this.
Okay. So just for a roadmap, Judge, I'm going to give a brief overview on how to structure the round, and then I'm going to go write down their case. Good over here?
Yeah.
Robert?
Is the overview on our side or?
The overview probably makes more sense to put on the app.
Okay.
And most importantly, Judge?
Okay. Actually, I just found it.
You want that now?
Yeah, I'll try to do both.
Yes, that way, yeah, you can have it. You can
Current
have it.
very belongs to EU countries.
Thanks. And this is Amnesty?
Wait, are you
Yes.
going to take rep though?
Yeah, I'm at the start.
Or do you guys, do you need this or you're just reading
Can you
it?
look at it?
What I'm saying is I don't need it. I have everything written
Oh,
down.
okay.
So you
You
can,
can just read it. Okay, I didn't know that.
you can use that during your rebuttal.
Okay.
Just
I'll just give it back to
when
you.
you're done, just put it
Or
here.
I'll put it there.
Yeah, works for me. Okay, so, good, Judge?
Hold it during the speech, please, okay?
Sorry, okay.
Okay. The most important impact in the round is going to be lives for two reasons. First, lives are irreversible. Once you lose a life, you can't get it back. And second, recognize it's going to be very, very important that we're saving lives in the short term so we can try and protect the conflict and end it in the long term. That being said, let's get into my opponent's first observation that talks about how asylum is the same thing as humanitarian aid. The biggest problem here is that don't let them pin it on us that's saying that like humanitarian, or rather that giving asylum is the same thing as like putting aid inside a country. That's not the same thing. There needs to be a clear delineation. Now let's get into their contention one. So the first part of their contention talks just about how conflict increases, but they don't give any warrants. But they get a little bit down the case. The first warrant that they give is conflict, right? First, they read this evidence that talks about how wealthy people are going to leave. Two big issues here. First, this evidence is non-unique. This is happening in the world of the con, and that's going to be really critical because when it happens in the world of con, that means that this brain drain that they talk about is only going to exacerbate the crisis. More and more people are going to die. But second, you can actually turn this argument against them because by creating these legal channels, which is going to happen by accepting refugees, essentially what's going to happen is going to decrease the cost, and it's going to also decrease like the physical and the monetary costs, but more importantly, the opportunity cost for people. Essentially, they don't actually have to go to smugglers because they're expensive, because now there's a legal route. Essentially, what they were trying to bring up in CROSSFIRE is that we can't advocate for these sorts of things or that it won't happen, but recognize what's actually going to happen in the long term is if these people open up their borders, it creates these legal channels. Hungary and places like that are closing their borders, that's the reason as to why these illegal channels are existing. But then they read this International Business Times argument that talks about essentially that they're making money from the black market. But you can turn this argument against them again, because we can again decrease the cost. And what this means is that now that more people are getting out, not just the wealthy, the black market, rather than expanding, is going to shrink. So in the long term, we see ISIS, as we tell you in case, having more or less money in the long term, which is going to be really critical because this is a clear link to lives. Because if we can decrease the funding of ISIS, the RAND Corporation tells you that's going to be a really cool way, or like a really important way to actually solve the crisis itself, is especially in terms of ISIS. Then they talk about interventionism. The first big issue here is this is 100% a last option. We don't just intervene when we want to. Take the United States, for example. People are very tired of intervening, especially after the Iraq War. We're not intervening anytime soon. There's not uniqueness to this argument. But second, recognize that NATO doesn't want to intervene. There are two clear warrants here. First is that if this was true, since this argument, since the Civil War has happened since 2011, we should have already seen this occurring. Unfortunately, we haven't. So when we look at a gut check, when we see their argument, if it's materialized, it hasn't materialized. But second, in fact, Cicero magazine explains that NATO doesn't want to intervene because they don't actually want to deal with having to help pick up after the crisis itself, after they go in and intervene and create instability. NATO admits that there is going to be instability. That's why they don't want to intervene, which means we're circumventing this argument about interventions. But recognize that they read this Reagan analysis that says there's going to be a 60% increase in or a 60% increase in like the probability of an intervention. The problem with this is that this analysis is essentially saying that any time there's a humanitarian crisis, this is going to happen. The only team that's giving you an avenue to solve the crisis is the world of the pro. And I'm going to tell you through their contention too how they're not solving it at all. So recognize that on their impacts, just very quickly, they don't get any links to these impacts because we're showing you that in the short term and in the long term, there's not actually going to be this intervention. They talk about Russia at the very end, but recognize Russia is an irrational actor, so you shouldn't look towards Russia to set the global stage. Russia's going to do what Vladimir Putin wants. That's not the same thing as like what the rest of the international community is going to want. On their international realism argument, two really big issues here. First, recognize that the important argument that they give from here is the ceasefire. But Slate magazine explains that this is a temporary agreement and is, quote, a long, long time from being fulfilled. They're not going to have peace in the short term. It's barely going to happen in the long term. So what we need to do is try and fix the problems in the status quo. And that's the refugee crisis. And that's exactly how we're going to solve the issue in itself. Because at the end of the day, we need to protect the refugees' lives, which my opponents simply aren't doing.
We have 132 remaining, so this is going to take like a lot of time right now. Starting now.
Okay.
We have 100 remaining.
Okay, so off-time roadmap, I'm just going to hit the observation he stated in his rebuttal and then go straight down their flow. Then if I have time remaining, I'm just going to like rebut his rebuttal, if that makes sense. Okay, so opponents ready? Anshul? Judge? Okay. Let's begin. Okay, with the observation about lives is the most important thing. Me and Ultra completely agree with that. We just don't want to escalate conflict, risking more lives. That's how we're going to agree with that. Let's go to this first contention of smuggling. And the main problem is it states countries of the world in the resolution, not just the EU. So this whole argument is non-resolutional in the first place. And they also say like 90% of refugees are smuggled, but the card only talks about Sweden. They're trying to place that on every single refugee in the world when it's only going to Sweden. So you're not going to weigh that. And second, Siegfried indicates that privatizing the smuggling efforts is just as effectively because it fills the gaps. And in fact, she continues that it's already happening with the MSF and the MAOS, starting new efforts in saving 3,000 refugees in just 2 months from smuggling. This effectively turns to advocacy right then and there because the private sector can do the same thing just better, so you don't need their legal channels. But now, let's go to their second part of their contention, on how legal channels can actually solve everything. A couple of problems with this. And first, their Amnesty International card they just showed me in Octofinals, it says that all EU countries have to agree between this to actually have it, but as we see the tensions rising in the EU right now, it's going to be impossible for all 28 nations just to agree on this, so you're not going to be accessing the impact. And second, IRN News tells us there's multiple reasons that this legal channels won't happen. And first, there's no means that the governments of Europe would sign up to the notion of making more legal channels, especially with the tension right there. And second, there'd be no distinguishing factor between regular migration and refugees, so they would all be treated the same when some are more in need than others because some are just going to migrate there and not be refugees. And third, more priority will be given to the best applicants, as you could say, leaving thousands just transit countries, because when you use the legal channel, you have to accept the application. If they don't want the refugee in their country because they're not going to benefit the country, then they just leave them there. And fourth, the number of people wishing to enter the country would exceed the number of places available, leaving some with no chance, but again, to be smuggled, escalating their harms. And lastly, it's going to make a pull factor, because if they know there are legal channels there, any migrant who just is from a weak economy is going to try to use these legal channels and come to Europe. It's a really big problem, because then it's just going to further overburden the countries, and you're not going to get any solvency from them. And next, you're actually going to turn this whole argument on them, because University of North Texas found that an empirical study, when 20,000 refugees go from one state to another, it increases the likelihood of interstate conflict by 85%. That means the countries don't actually end up cooperating. These legal channels don't work. You're just creating conflict in these countries. And next, Pastor from Council on Foreign Relations indicates that anti-refugee sentiments are rising in Europe, and for instance, violence against asylum seekers increased by 132% in 2014, and the EU countries have failed to implement and enforce provisions with any consistency, again showing that there's so much anti-refugee sentiment going in the EU right now. There's again not going to be any possible way these legal changes are going to be approved by every single nation in the EU. It just doesn't make any logical sense. So fourthly and lastly, since they don't solve for that, we're just going to see escalation of the civil war. That's why Onto Redu and Constructive that more of FSU tells us that every year civil war causes 79% more refugees, and they have no solvency on their side. And next, let's go to their second contention, what they're going to rid these camps. And the first problem is camps are all in Europe, and all because you affirm does not mean camps go away. They say like legal channels are going to like solve these camps, but again, if you don't have the legal channels, then you're not going to solve the camps. And all because you take in more refugees does not mean camps suddenly go away. They don't have any warrant behind that. And second, if you just look at the scope of the argument, only 15% of refugees are actually in camps according to the Red Cross. This minimizes the whole impact on face value because they don't have majority of refugees. And now let's go to his rebuttal real quick. So first with his walk to our conflict with the wealthy people staying. So all he's saying is like they decrease the cost of the black market if they create these legal channels. But again, if we show the EU countries can't agree on these legal channels, then you're not going to be getting the impact. The main problem with his rebuttal is he says legal channels solve everything, but if you don't have the legal channel, then you're not going to get any solvency. And next, let's go to his block to our intervention argument, because he said we would have already seen this occurring, but also showed you that Turkey's already literally expanded into northern Syria, and the intervention is literally happening right now. That's what they don't understand. They're in northern Syria right now. They're expanding the camp right there. They're going invading right now. And lastly, he said that Russia's irrational, but they're part of countries in the world that's just not very good. For these reasons, we're just calmed out. Thank you.
Yes. We're going to run just a little bit of trouble for us. That was 48 seconds used. Should we put 48 seconds? 47? 47.
Is everyone ready? Alright, you get first question.
So do you mind if I ask you something about what you read in the rebuttal?
Go ahead.
Okay, so to our contention one, you read this term from UNT, right? That's the that's Salihan, right? Aydin Salihan.
I mean, sure.
Okay, what does Aydin Salihan say at the end of her conclusion?
I mean, I haven't really read the full article.
Okay, well, I'll tell you then. What she says is that most of these most of the movements of refugees don't actually lead to conflict and violence, and the mass majorities never engage in fighting. So does that deal with your term?
Where does 85?
What I'm asking is if it
how
deals
does
with
she
your
get that if 20,000 refugees go from one state to another?
It was a
then
statistical
85%?
model. It was a
That's a
statistic.
pretty solid statistical model. Like,
I mean, you yourself said you haven't even read it. I'm
okay,
telling you what the conclusion says.
Can you show us where in the conclusion, like after this?
This is what the
Give it
author
a shake. Okay, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay, so when are all these EU countries like going to agree to have legal channels everywhere?
Okay,
If, like,
so here's the problem with what you say, right? You're like assuming that we don't get to fiat that this happens, but we do. In the world of the pro, right? What we're saying is that countries of the world will accept the refugees. That's what's going to happen.
The EU isn't countries of the world. That's only 28 nations. In the
Right,
world.
I agree.
So you're already having like the minimal impact.
Wait, how is that a minimal impact?
Because that's
Where do you
not
think
even
the
all countries of the world.
Okay,
And secondly,
it doesn't
there's
say all the countries, does it? The resolution doesn't say all the
so we
countries.
can pick specific countries now.
No, but what I'm saying is the highest probability of where these people are going to go is Europe, because
Okay,
that's what people are
got
saying.
it. But you just don't show me like they're all going to agree. Like if we showed that the anti-refugee sentiment has already going up, how are they now going to agree? Like, oh, let's all make legal channels for refugees.
Wait, what?
Like, if we already showed that anti-refugee sentiment is going up in Europe right now, how are all the EU nations going to suddenly agree we're all going to make legal channels now?
That's what happens in the world of pro. What we're telling you is that
No, you don't show me, like,
that
because
is
you're
fiated, right? Like, we get to do that. That's what happens.
You can't just suddenly make all the EU nations agree. That's a big problem. Like, it won't happen because none of them want to do
It
this.
happens in the world of pro. Your only warrant is that
How is it
xenophobia,
going
right?
to happen?
So your warrant is xenophobia, right? Let's address this,
Okay,
right?
go ahead.
Okay. Why should we, like, care about what people who are racist think?
Okay, no, I'm not saying like, okay, like the racist citizens don't want it. I'm
Right.
saying the EU governments actually don't want it. If, for example, like if Germany doesn't want to do it, then they're
Germany
not going
does want to do it.
Okay, that was just an example.
Okay,
Pick
can you
any
give me
country
an
in the
example that
pick
doesn't?
any country in the EU.
No, you
But
give
it
me an
just
example.
Pick, and I'm pretty sure Germany just closed their borders actually.
No.
But they actually did. But also, if you just look at that, if you could pick any country in the EU, the anti-refugee sentiment just went up. So therefore, like you have to show me every nation in the EU is actually going to agree and say, okay, we'll make a legal channel.
Okay, do you have a question?
Yeah. Okay. So if you make legal channels, right? How are you going to distinguish between refugees and migrants, and won't just more people come now, like overburdening these countries again?
Okay, that's like, okay, first off, it's not going to overburden them. Recognize that the EU countries are pretty big, and the number of people that are coming are going to be dispersed across the country.
Okay, but you'll
But
get
second,
more and more coming because
right.
it's not just
So
refugees
you say
anymore.
that it's a pull factor, right? But let's take it very simply, right?
'Cause they'll just
Refugees are the
cherry-pick the
people
ones
who are going to come. Even if economic migrants come, you don't show
They
any
just cherry
distinguishing.
pick the migrants and not
Okay,
the
yeah,
refugees.
okay, just don't let me finish. That's fine.
Oh, sorry. We have 47 seconds remaining. Starting now.
Yes. Okay. Just a little roadmap to clarify my speech. I'm first going to start on the overview, which you can still cleanly flow in the affirmative. Then I'm going to go down the negative case and back to the affirmative case and why I'll be voting for this. So to simplify, pro, con, pro. Okay. Carlos, are you ready? My opponents?
Yep.
And most importantly, the judge, are you ready? All right. So let's get started. Remember what Carlos has already said, the most important impacts on states around those concerning lives because they're irreversible, and secondly, the short term helps prevent the long term. They agree to this, and that's going to be really critical because you'll see that by affirming, we save more lives than the negative does, but going on to the negative case specifically. There's contention one about disaster. Now, there's a really critical one single warrant that we've already destroyed clearly in today's round, and their warrant is like this intervention will happen. Carlos has already proven with the NATO evidence that the NATO will simply not intervene because NATO won't intervene. All these impacts will simply just not occur that they mentioned. Remember the turn Carlos makes. Remember, legal channels will reduce like the amount of money these terror organizations have. If you truly want to reduce conflict, you will still affirm the resolution. And that's what they want to do. They want to reduce conflict, but you affirm. Going into the contention about international realism, it cleanly extends the slate analysis Carlos gives you. It tells you that a temporary ceasefire will not have peace in the long term. That's really critical because we tell you we save lives in the short term to prevent long-term conflict. They advocate for conflict. The only way to advocate for conflict is by affirming. But the reason why specifically you'll be voting for the affirmative, there are two biggest arguments. The first of those being smuggling. We advocate for legal channels. The UN tells us that the EU's current restrictive borders are preventing refugees. You look towards the European Union because the resolution says countries of the world. That can be anything. European Union is the most probable. You look at what's probable. Their only response is it's not probable. Remember, we get fiat that refugees will go into Europe. We can't do that as affirming, otherwise we'd have no impacts. That's not the point of the debate. That's not the point of the debate. Their only warrant is xenophobia. The only way to combat xenophobia is integrating refugees in Europe. That's a fact. It's worked historically. But the second reason why I'll be voting for the affirmative is they've completely dropped our second contention about camps. Robbins tells, and specifically like saving lives in the first contention, Robbins tells us 381,000 lives will be lost by sea. We save those lives through legal channels. But now going to our second contention, they completely dropped. It cleanly can reduce disease. Lum tells us because there's no health infrastructure, disease will spread, infectious disease kills people. That's not saving lives. If you want to save lives, you still affirm. Don't let the con ignore the pro impacts. We get the fiat, we have our impacts, we save the most amount of lives, we empirically prove it. For these reasons, Carlos and I are very proud to affirm.
Okay, we'll run that.
That was on your prep, right?
Yeah. How we doing
You
it?
had a minute 10 left, just use 12, let's say 10.
So-
40 seconds left.
I'll address how they said we want to weigh the lives and then just extending some of Blake's responses on their case and like what they said in summary essentially. And then I'll just give you the impacts of our case. All right. Are you guys ready?
Yes.
Blake, you ready? And the judge? All right. We both agreed to weigh this round on lives. Insofar as they increase the number of refugees being created and harmed, and our world is the only one who can even attempt to save lives, you can negate right there. But second, let's focus on the summary. Extend the response that Blake gives you in rebuttal onto smuggling. They try to indict Salehan and Cross, but I read his computer, it literally says they concluded, quote, there was a positive correlation between the very presence of refugees from a neighboring country and conflict. That's critical because their plan literally is going to increase conflict, even if you buy their hypothetical legal channels plan, which we're going to refute now. Look to the rise of the right-wing anti-refugee parties all throughout Europe. Two things. First, violence against asylum seekers increased 123% throughout Europe in 2014. Blake read you that, you heard no response from them. But second, these right-wing parties are literally gaining seats in parliament, whether that's Germany, Belgium, Britain, you name it, and so there's no way that this can be passed. You can drop their plan right there, but second, even if you do think that their plan passes, recognize that migrants and wealthy refugees are cherry-picked because, like Blake reads, they can offer more skill to these xenophobic policymakers. That's critical because they don't solve the problem, and he just extends camps in his summary, but remember that Blake tells you that first, there are camps in Europe where refugees would come through these quote legal channels that they're trying to pass, but second, only 15% of refugees are in camps, so drop them on face value in terms of the impact that they solve. Now the one term that they extend in summary on our side of the flow in contention one is NATO, but we literally tell you that that organization along with Turkey have built camps in northern Syria along within Turkey in order to attract refugees so that they can justify intervention. Now that we've cleanly won the link debate, our main voter is the flawed narrative of the pro. Here are the three big impacts. First, remember that Gillespie tells you that voting pro only exacerbates human rights due to interventions resulting in more abuse. We tell you the empirical study that interventions increase killing by 103%, which happens if you vote for pro today. Second, Schnetzel says that voting pro creates 59,000 more refugees because rebels believe that militarizing will attract interventions. The con outweigh the pros on time frame and impacts because the pro keeps the crisis continuing, and we tell you the spillover effect with Russia. But third and most importantly, every time the con comes up here and tells you, or the pro comes up here and tells you that we have any sort of like obligation or we have to save these lives, they play into an interventionist narrative. Their mindset in reality prioritizes the guilt to save these refugees who are being hurt, but not the consequences. For these reasons, we negate.
All right, are y'all ready for Grand Cross?
Yeah. Yeah. You guys have the first question?
Okay, so
Judge, you ready?
Okay. So my first question for you is, you just ended your summary with talking about our intervention-like perspective. I guess the first easy question is yes or no, have we advocated on our case for intervention?
No, I'm not saying you guys are
Yes or no, just yes or no, please.
You guys didn't understand what I just said.
Okay, well, then let me ask my second question. So why did you completely ignore, like in the past few speeches, we telling you that the group you advocate for intervention, specifically is NATO has no probability of intervening?
No, we literally see like Turkey's already in northern Syria.
Wait.
Okay, that's not
Because he's
NATO.
building camps.
No,
The
Turkey
camps are
is,
expanding.
yeah, it's Turkey and NATO. Like they're
That's
being.
not intervention.
Do
That's
you want to like
intervention.
read the whole? Okay, they're literally breaking like territorial sovereignty right
Wait,
there.
but so let me ask you this.
Bashar al-Assad, like, he gave up his right to sovereignty when he used chemical weapons.
So they can't violate a sovereignty that doesn't
They're
exist.
still invading another country. Like, I don't see like.
But they're not.
But the
Because
second
they're
thing is,
state.
the second thing is that sovereignty you guys talk about. That's a Western perspective. There's other people that still recognize Syria's sovereignty. So like.
Who? I don't think a single country does.
Maybe
Bashar
Russia,
al-Assad
that's
has
about it.
has like no allies besides like Russia. Even then, he's bombing the country. Is Russia not violating their own sovereignty? I think sovereignty is like a made up like thing that has no impact.
Okay, but regardless, they're going into Syria's quote former sovereignty. Like regardless of what it is called now, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the impacts still
Okay,
stand. Can you ask me a question now?
We need to make just a quick delineation. What exactly are you saying is intervening? Just being
Can you
there?
just define it?
No, we're saying, okay, so here, let me explain it again. When you're accepting refugees, like for example, we're talking about the Turkey camps in NATO, now they're creating
You
camps.
know, we remove camps, but
Keep going. Keep going.
Yeah, so okay, first of all, you don't because that's only 15%.
Well, that'll be our question after.
Okay,
Keep going.
yeah, so once they use that to justify intervening into Syria, and that's the thing that is increasing conflict. But what we're saying is, our world, in spite of all that, our world is the only one who gets close to solving that because of the ceasefire. Like, you guys don't even show anything that why you would solve it. Because when you guys talk about refugee camps, so like, can we ask the question now?
Yeah, go ahead.
So you said like if we create legal channels, like camps are just like gonna go.
No.
No, you're
Like,
just
how are
okay,
camps?
so
Okay, can you tell me how camps are gonna go?
Let me clarify.
Like, that's what European countries use.
just let me clarify. So in the world of the affirmative, you say accepting is aid. What we say accepting is removing camps and training. No, don't.
Not just aid.
You're not letting me explain.
Okay, just go.
You have to let me explain.
Okay.
What we describe what accept is removing camps and legal channels.
You
That's
can't
contention
just,
one,
wait, can I see
contention
like a
two.
definition that says accepting a refugee
Wait,
means getting
what
rid of
the-
camps? Like,
okay.
you can't define something as getting rid of camps.
We're giving you a connotative definition here. What we're saying is
I
that
know.
acceptance isn't just stacking them in camps.
I know,
When
that's
I
like a-
accept a person, like
It's like a
not
silo.
based
No,
on their
that's the problem. Is because like that is like what's happening right now.
Right,
If you affirm
you're
that's
right.
not going to change.
It is
like,
what's
that's
happening right now.
If you
What
accept
we're
refugees,
saying
they're going
is
to go
that-
to camp. That's the main problem.
But here's
That's
the
not going
second
to
thing.
change.
What
Here's
we're
the
saying is there's
second
a
thing.
paradigm shift.
Okay,
That's what's
so
That's
would you
not
say,
this
let's
thing.
say, would you say more than, if your plan works, would you say over 1 million refugees are gonna go to Europe?
maybe.
Yeah, so how can they just build 1 million homes in 1 million communities, or like so many communities, instead of putting them in
Is it
camps?
camps?
That doesn't solve.
We've done it before with the Holocaust. I think we can do it again in the future.
6 million.
So, Judge, I'm just going to talk about their major voters, and then I'm going to give our major voters. And then lives will be like sort of integrated in all of it. Good? Good over here?
Yeah.
Robert?
Yes.
Okay. So recognizing that in the last summary, they extended a lot of impacts but not a lot of warrants, and they definitely didn't respond to exactly what Robert tells you on the intervention argument. That's where they put all their eggs in one basket. But remember that Robert gives you the 2 warrants as to why NATO isn't intervening. We should have already seen this type of intervention already. They contend that it's already intervening because, like, Turkey has put camps in Syria, but nowhere have they delineated exactly what this means. The intervention arguments that they're trying to go for are ones in which military intervention occurs. That's what the analysis that they're trying to give you says. That's not the same thing as what Turkey is giving, so at that point they don't actually solve. But then he also extends Cicero Magazine, who tells you that NATO doesn't want to intervene because they don't want to deal with the crisis of like trying to pick up after they go in. Essentially, NATO's not intervening anytime soon. There's no probability of this, which means lives are still going to be lost in the long term. But the second reason, and on their side of the flow, on their arguments, that lives are going to continue to be lost in the world econ comes from the Slate analysis, which essentially tells you that Robert extends on the ceasefire argument that it's still a long, long way from being fulfilled, which means in the short term, people are dying now, right? So if we truly care about lives, then the way to save them is opening up these borders and legal channels. And that means that we are going to link into lives the hardest. We link in 2 ways. First is through European channels. That's what the United Nations tells you. They try to respond by saying that migrants are going to be cherry-picked and there's going to be xenophobia, and so that means that we can't solve. But we can solve. The reason we can solve this argument is because we get to show you that in the world of the pro, acceptance means that these people are coming in. They're opening up the borders. These European countries, even if there is some xenophobia, that doesn't matter because lives are much more important, like the xenophobic rhetoric that's coming from politicians. That's going to be really critical. But more importantly, the second, or rather, that means that the Robbins analysis that Robert extends shows you specifically that we're going to be able to save these people's lives who are forced to go to smugglers because of these closed borders. The second way that we link in has to do with camps. And this doesn't have anything to do with like the legal channels. This has to do with acceptance of refugees, integrating them into society. And they haven't responded to this. And that's why the LUM analysis tells you that we're going to be able to stop this terrible health infrastructure which leads to diseases and loss of life. At the end of the day, not only are we saving the refugees who are coming, but the refugees who are there. And for these reasons, we are very proud to affirm.
We'll run the rest of our 40 seconds starting now.
Is this your phone?
Oh, I get it.
Just as an off-time roadmap, just observation, mainly like touching his final focus, and then our main voter. All right, so my opponent's ready. Anshul, Judge. Okay, let's begin. Remember that when you're deciding to vote pro or con today, the biggest part of this round is lies. Not all the EU countries will agree on these legal channels, so the pro world is impossible. And even if you think legal channels will be created, the countries just cherry pick the migrants because of the pull factor happening, and not the refugees. Also explained that in a summary, and I extended my rebuttal. So either way, the refugees' lives are going to be saved. They cannot suddenly say legal channels are going to be created if it's impossible because of this EU tension that they did not refute. And if you don't buy one thing me and Anshul tell you, you can't possibly vote for them because of a lack of feasibility. Then they're trying to say like these camps are now going to suddenly go away, but again, it's impossible if you don't have legal channels. And if you have more refugees going to Europe, you're going to need more camps because they can't build 1 million houses. But now, me and Anshul show you a main way that lives are lost, and that main way is conflict escalation, with first part of that being intervention. Because Cartolucci states that the refugees are gathering in camps that are in Turkey, and so NATO can soon invade Syria. They're already in northern Syria. We see Turkey's already there, and this is a prime example. And they forget the second big war Anshul read in case from Milton, who tells you that as aggression increases, you have a downward spiral of more aggression, and that's why you have Russia, US, and other countries intervening also. We saw Russia's airstrikes creating 100,000 more refugees. The two impacts result from this, and first is the human rights abuse. As Northwestern tells us that interventions make rebels try to attack more intervention, escalating conflict leading to 103% more killings, 66% more torture, and 70% more imprisonment, which did not go refuted. Second, there's more refugees because 59,000 more flee when there's an intervention, and again, we saw Russia make 100,000 more refugees. Next, we say that remember that Anshul defended Saley in his summary because refugees between states cause 85% more conflict overall between the interstate conflict. Overall, it's a big turn right there. And lastly, Anshul extended summary that inaction is actually the best option because the ceasefire caused conflict in Syria to go down by 90%. That's why the con world is better than the pro world. So you can turn their entire advocacy on face value because their flawed humanitarian narrative of accepting more refugees will only harm more refugees. Instead, you should vote con to avoid the pro's interventionist rhetoric, and you can outweigh here because we're the only ones actually working towards a better world. So for these reasons, we're con ballot. Thank you.